Hey, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Rabbit. As a follow up to my previous episode regarding my first look at the Nazca Mummies, following an interview that Pavel did with Dr. Zalce and Dr. Rios, I was able to interview Dr. José Zalce directly. He is the first medical doctor, the first forensic anthropologist to have studied the bodies, the Nazca bodies in Peru in 2017. We sort of jumped right into the interview, and I didn't get a chance to get all of his credentials and expertise. It is a very lengthy and impressive resume, so I will just link that in the description below. But just to get a snippet of it, he is a lieutenant colonel of the Mexican Navy, a naval surgeon, and the former head of health and research and development for the Mexican Navy. This is really important that is said. While he is professionally involved with the Navy as a career, he wants to make it very clear that his opinions and this investigation that he's doing relating to the mummies is not the opinion of the Navy. So this is separate and his own opinion that he does in his own free time. So that's really important to highlight. Like I mentioned, I was a skeptic, pretty hard skeptic. I actually didn't even dig into it initially when I saw these bodies a year ago. And it was thanks to Pavel's interview that it really made me take a second look. I think it's really important to listen to what Dr. José Zalce has to say. He has, as I mentioned, a very extensive list of credentials and experience in order to make these types of determinations. And so my point and my hope here is that we get at least one person to kind of take a look at it and give it a second shot. And we don't have to make a decision that it's 100% real. There are still more studies to be done, more doctors to corroborate, which will only lend credibility to the finding. But the first step is to keep an open mind and listen to Dr. José Zalce. Okay, so without any further ado, here is Dr. Zalce for Cosmic Rabbit. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Hello and welcome. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Zalce, who joins us from Mexico. He is one of the forensic doctors who directly examine the Nazca bodies in Peru. Thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Zalce, how are you?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here and willing to answer all the questions and to give my opinion and my point of view on the investigations of the Nazca bodies.
Thank you very much. Okay, for the people, because I'm realizing that in the social networks, there are a lot of English-speaking people who still don't have the very basic information. So I want you to be able to tell us a little bit, talk briefly, explaining the initial findings. For example, if you can tell us about the lawsuit or a little bit about Mario, who was the one who found the bodies, and the last thing, which is the lack of interest from the scientific community, if you can start with that.
Of course, with pleasure. First of all, I want to explain a little bit that we are analyzing some bodies that were found around 2017 in Peru, in the region of Nazca, Palpa, and Ica. These bodies are actually two different ones. There are 60 centimeter bodies that we call small bodies. Among these small bodies, you can find those named Josefina, Albert, Victoria, Clara, Mauricio, that all have a similarity of approximately 60 centimeters and a lot of similarity in their anatomical structure. The other bodies that were found are bodies of greater appearance and greater similarity to the human being. They are bodies of about 1.20 meters to 170 meters in height. The first of these bodies and the most famous is the body named Maria, which also appeared in 2017, and later in the year 2023, other bodies appeared named Sebastian, Santiago, and Montserrat. Montserrat's body takes on main relevance because inside, in her abdomen, the remains of a fetus were found, and this fetus was named Rafael. So having this context of these bodies that were all found in the same area, in the same region of Palpa and Nazca, and that are under the custody and protection of the university, the bodies were found in the same area, in the same region of Palpa and Nazca from ICA. Now I can explain that among the findings we have had, the most relevant is the DNA, because 30% of the DNA does not correspond to anything known and described in current science, and the remaining 70% has some features or residues of different species, such as the bonobo monkey from Africa, the chimpanzee, and in relation to humans, it is related to a phylogeny of humans from South Asia, specifically from the Philippines. But this 70%, which is very little, very scarce in terms of the capacity or possibility of relating it to something, keeps relevance. But it is more important the 30% that is different, because if we as humans have a similarity with primates of about 98% and only 2% difference, and if we go with the bacterium, and the bacterium we have around 85 to 88% of similarity, that is to say 12 to 15% of difference, then the 15% of difference that we have with the bacterium, this 30% that was found of difference of unknown DNA with these bodies is the double of what we could have in a correlation of the evolution of the DNA of different species on the planet. Is very relevant because we are dealing with something completely different and unassociated to what we have described in the evolution of species and in Darwin's taxonomy of species. On the other hand, we have as relevant data all the particularities in the anatomy, such as the size of the skull in the body of Maria, the arrangement of the bones, the robustness of these bones, but the most relevant of these large bodies is that they are tridactyl. They have 3 fingers, 3 toes. These 3 dactyli that we also have 3 phalanges, but in the large bodies of Maria, Sebastian, Santiago, and Montserrat, the phalanges they have are 4 to 5 phalanges. So they are much longer fingers than us. And this tridactyly has a direct relationship with small bodies of 60 centipetos, which are also tridactyl in hands and feet. Within the studies that have been done, X-rays, CT scans, tomography, 3-dimensional reconstruction of this CT scan, fluoroscopy, DNA sampling, metallurgy, and carbon-14 have been performed. Starting with carbon-14, it is A, relevant data because it tells us about the age of this specimen. And here is something relevant because carbon-14 only analyzes organic matter. Therefore, we cannot analyze a man-made element, a craft or something artificial. It has to be purely organic material. In carbon-14, we find that in the 60 centimeter bodies are approximately 800 to 1200 years old. And in large bodies like the Demaria, in the Demaria, we find that it is 1500 to 1700 years old. Therefore, in the general context, in the context of public perception, we are talking about an average of more than 1000 years old. These more than 1000 years old make these two species far, far removed from what we have today. And this is of relevance because we make the correlation to the technology that they have in the metallic implants that we have found, that they have in the chest, in the skull, or in some parts of the back of the hand and in some joints. Well, these metallic implants have metals such as cadmium and osmium. Cadmium and osmium are very rare metals that are very difficult to obtain in an alloy and are only 200 years old and are currently used for satellite communications. Therefore, finding them in bodies and in metals more than 1000 years old, it has great relevance. Here we have already talked about DNA, we have already talked about carbon-14, we have already talked about some particularities of these bodies. Here comes something important because these bodies are what we call the official bodies that are in the custody and preservation of the University of Ica. That is where these bodies are physically located and where they are freely accessible to anyone, especially any scientist who wants to study them, learn about them, and take their own samples to obtain their own results. These bodies that are there at Inca University, they have a problem. They are already in a process of degradation. Why? The person who found them, Mario, found them in a region near Nazca and Palpa, where there are silica mountains, where mining is very important. And in these silica mountains, one of the peculiarities or particularities is that they have a large amount of diatomaceous earth powder. This diatom powder is the white material that covers the bodies. Both the 60 centimeter bodies and the large bodies such as Maria are entirely covered with this diatom powder. The diatom is a fossilized algae of many thousands of years ago that allows the desiccation of organic bodies, that is the dehydration that favors the conservation by a process of natural mummification, desiccation, but also avoids the generation and proliferation of fungi and bacteria that could degrade the bodies. In addition, they prevent the generation of cadaveric fauna, which are these small insects that gradually eat the organism. Therefore, this diatomite powder is something that perfectly allows the preservation of these bodies in the context in which they were found. It leads us to believe that the people or whoever deposited these bodies in this place knew perfectly well and had a clear intention of preserving and conserving them. This diatomaceous earth powder is very important because it is what allows conservation until the present day, which is the finding. However, once these bodies were removed from the site, the process of degradation and decomposition continues. Therefore, the fact that they are at the University of Ica is a very good thing because they are under the custody of an independent academic body, but it is very important to support them in order to have these bodies in the best conditions of conservation and preservation, because otherwise they will begin to degrade, they will begin to fracture, break, and the time will come when they will be pulverized and disappear completely. Now, the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, which has been asked for support and access so that these bodies could be preserved and studied since the first moment in 2016, expressed its rejection of this research and this great finding. Unfortunately, recently, I think it was last year, in the past, in 2023, I don't know if 2022, 2023, the Ministry of Culture seized two bodies, two figures that were seized at the Peruvian airport. The Ministry of Culture declared these two figures as frauds, as recent handicrafts made with papier-mâché and glue, and with that tried to discredit completely the case of the Nazca bodies. However, here the Ministry of Culture made two mistakes. The first is that it took a position that these bodies are false, with two different bodies and outside of what we consider to be official bodies that are under the protection of the University of Ica. What do I mean by this? That the Ministry of Culture, in order to take a position, should have studied the same bodies from which all the studies and analyses that we have projected were obtained, and not take a position or an opinion on two supposed bodies or dolls that they seized. No, it cannot be a different source. First error. And the second error is that these bodies were requested to undergo different analyses, first at the Ministry of Justice in the Department of Legal Medicine, which declared itself incompetent due to lack of human and technological resources. And this Ministry of Justice, its Department of Forensic Medicine, refers it to the Ministry of Health, to its Department of Forensic Medicine and Molecular Biology. And the Department of Molecular Medicine of the Ministry of Health states in writing, and it is in the public documents, that it also declares itself incompetent because it does not have the appropriate specialists or the optimum technology, but it recognizes, it acknowledges, it recognizes that it is dealing with organic and old material. Therefore, if the two highest forensic investigation entities, not archaeological but forensic, declare themselves incompetent in Peru, how is it possible that the Ministry of Culture qualifies as false something that has neither the competence nor the professional or technological elements to study them? These two errors generated an atmosphere of fraud in relation to the person of Jaime Maussan and the whole case of the Nazca bodies. This is why Mr. Jaime Maussan filed a lawsuit, a $1 million lawsuit against the Ministry of Culture and the government of Peru for $300 million for defamation. What is the intention with this $300 million? Obviously, it is not for the personal enrichment of Mr. Jaime Maussan. The intention, and it is clear within the lawsuit process, is to generate a trust that allows the creation of a museum, and the creation of this museum allows the conservation and preservation of these bodies, as well as the purchase of technological equipment to carry out and deepen the studies and analysis of them. Likewise, to generate an academic body that allows international cooperation with other universities and other museums to be able to take these bodies, these mummies, and have them analyzed by other scientists in other places and then return to Peru. This is what this $300 million claim is intended to do. So far, we have obtained great results in DNA, great results in image reports, X-ray images, tomographies, reconstructions. We have obtained histopathology results. We have obtained results of skeletal structure analysis, of comparative anatomy. But this brings us to coincidentally, having presented 2 of these bodies in the Mexico City Congress on September 12, 2023, and with the opening to the classification of issues of this nature in the US Congress, Mr. Jaime Maussan has been in contact with one of the representatives. I don't know if he is a senator or a representative, whose name is Tim Burchett, and they have been in contact to share information and take this issue to the US Congress with the intention, the only intention, that scientists from anywhere in the world become involved in the research of these bodies. But here comes the interesting thing to get involved, and that the invitation is open. You have to go to Peru. You don't have to stay in your offices or at your desks behind a computer or your computer just issuing personal opinions. You have to go to the study site. You have to go to the study elements to see them personally, physically, and take your own samples to get your own results and then make a comparison. This has already been done by a high-level doctor, Dr. John McDowell from Denver, Colorado, who has already visited the Nazca bodies in Peru and has already taken his own data. And now, thanks to Dr. John McDowell, the community of medical scientists in the forensic areas has become much more involved in this subject. And I think this is where we can talk about the need for greater openness and participation of the world's scientists to be incorporated into the analysis of these bodies. That independently, and I want to make one thing clear here, independently of the fact that they have been related or linked to extraterrestrial beings, and this is because of the figure of Mr. Jaime Maussan and his journalistic profile. At no time have the scientists who have participated in this exhibition, in this investigation, at no time, starting with myself, have we stated that they are extraterrestrial beings. We have limited ourselves to saying and concluding that we are facing 2 new species that have not been identified, that have not been described, and that deserve to be studied to be incorporated in the natural evolution of species, in Darwin's taxonomic tree, in the biology we know, but that with their differences, with their particularities, and with the results we have been having, especially with DNA, we are facing something that does not correspond to what we know and have already described currently in science. Therefore, we are facing something completely different and foreign to terrestrial evolution as we know it. And this is where we open up and break the paradigm. We are not saying that they are extraterrestrials, although it could be a possibility. We are saying that they are original biological real bodies that once had life and that must be analyzed because they are a parallel and convergent line to human evolution. And this is something that could change our history, the conception of evolution as the human species claims it and has it by now, and perhaps change the history of the planet and humanity. That's all I could tell you in a quick summary form, but I am open to any questions and expand on any doubts or comments you may have.
No, thank you very much. That was perfect for clarifying many things that I think are very basic to then go into the details. And I liked that you also clarified that none of the scientists have said that it is extraterrestrial, only bodies that are biological, that are real. and that there is no tampering or manipulation of any kind either. So yes, thank you very much for clarifying all that. Now let's start with some questions I have. First of all, how did you feel the first time you saw the bodies in person, the little ones and Maria's? What did you think at that moment?
Well, in the first instance, I was invited by Mr. Jaime Mausan to go to Peru to analyze these bodies, and the invitation was very clear and concrete. It was with the intention of refuting any presentation that was given to us. That is to say, I went with all the skepticism and with the position of denial that this was real. Therefore, when we arrived there precisely in Cusco, in a house that belongs to the Inkari Institute, and we were presented with some small bodies of 20s to 30s meter, all crooked, poorly made, poorly assembled, I immediately said, well, this looks old and has an antique value, but it is not a specimen, an organic body that at the time had life, and I immediately discarded it. However, after seeing these little bodies, we were presented with two bodies, the one we know as Josefina and the one we know as Albert, and here things changed because there was a congruence and harmony in their anatomical structure, in their skeleton. And to refute any doubt as to whether they were constructed or not, independently of an inspection made on the entire surface of the skin tissue, where no scars could be seen, where no sutures could be seen, where no traces of alteration or assembled could be seen, I requested that X-ray studies be made on them. This is to see if inside they had some kind of arming. When we went and did these X-rays, the surprise was incredible because the union between each bone had a harmony between the end of a bone and the beginning of the next bone. That is to say, the joints had a harmony that corresponded between one bone and the other, and also the wear of this joint was seen, the wear and tear of the movement that a ser vivo has in a joint. It was therefore a striking image. But what was most striking was in Josefina's case to find 3 eggs in her abdomen that we thought were stones, but when we put them in, we found that they were not. More attention on the X-ray image. We saw that the image was translucent, i.e., it allowed us to see the posterior structures of the egg. And this made me think that they were eggs of organic origin and not petrifactions or stones embedded inside. Therefore, I requested the CT scans, the CBCT scans, to be done when we got there. This allows millimetric studies and allows large magnifications of the area we are studying. And for me, it was a game-changing surprise to find that in the abdomen, in addition to these 3 large eggs, there was a calcification of less than 1 millimeter in size inside a duct. And then we saw that this was a 4th egg in a duct that is called the oviduct, which is attached to the area of the gestation and development process of these eggs, exactly like birds. That was fantastic because replicating it or doing it artificially is practically impossible. In addition, we were able to see other elements such as blood vessels, ligaments, tendons, and neuronal bundles in the tomography. And this obviously makes it impossible to replicate. Furthermore, we saw that the union of the bones, the union of the joints, and the wear and tear by movement of this was completely coincident with the biomechanics of these bodies. Therefore, that was where 2010 I decided to position myself in the idea that this is real, that they were real organic bodies, that at the time they had life, and that there was no way they could have been weaponized, falsified, or altered before or after their death, in life or already dead. There was no way. Therefore, moving forward in the investigation and together with Dr. Konstantin Korotkov from Russia, who was there, we decided to take the samples for DNA and carbon-14 studies. Both studies can obviously only be performed on organic substances, and can obviously be performed on species or specimens that have had life and evolution. The doctor took his samples, I took mine, he took them to the St. Petersburg Institute of Technology, and they got their results. Surprised that regardless of the laboratory, 3 different laboratories, the results were similar, both in antiquity, speaking as I explained from 800 to 1200 years old for the small bodies, and from 1500 to 1700 years old in the body of Maria. And also in the DNA, because that DNA was compared with more than 1 million species, and it did not correspond to any of them, neither as filiation nor as ancestor or predecessor. And that within that DNA we had 30% that is completely unknown.
Between the two species?
That's right. DNA was taken from each species, and what coincides here is that each DNA, both from the small bodies and from the large body of Maria, as the results are that 30% is completely unknown to what we have recorded in the current scientific knowledge.
Okay, just to be sure I understood correctly, the small and large bodies, the two species are different in 30%.
That is correct.
Okay. When I started to investigate, I think that the point that diminished my doubt was when I think it was an interview with Joyce Mantilla, that he had said that the difference between human fingers is only 1 millimeter, and for Maria and Montserrat it was like 9 the space between the fingers. And that to me, well, I don't know because I'm not a doctor or anything, but can you tell me, that would be very obvious if they are cutting the fingers and moving them, because to have such a big space, you can easily see that in a tomography, in an X-ray, right?
That's right, just as you are saying. And as Joyce Mantilla mentioned, the possibility of altering or modifying a hand to remove fingers or add phalanges is completely difficult. It is not impossible, it is difficult. There are surgical procedures for amputation of fingers, but there are no surgical procedures for inlaying new fingers that are functional, or for the elongation of fingers that are functional. So then, what you say and what Joyce Mantilla mentions is correct. The possibility of altering this is extremely difficult. And from a forensic point of view, there are only 2 prospects that this would be done in someone or something that had been alive. And for that, then there would be tissue repair, what we know as scarring. And this would be visible on any X-ray and CT scan, natural tissue repair. But if done on a dead person or someone dead, this biological repair would not exist. And in the absence of such biological repair, there would necessarily have to be a cutting site and joining elements such as glue, tissue, suture, wire, threads, you name it. Nor is it observed in any of the hands and feet, which tells us that they are anatomical structures that have not been altered, but are also perfectly functional in the perspectives of the bodies that were found.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences in the characteristics between the two? Because I know that, for example, the small ones of 60 centimeters have that, what is called the furcula, but I think that Maria does not have something like that, right? And the little ones have tridactyl hands and feet, but Maria has feet that also have like one that goes down. Yes. Can you tell us a little about the characteristics of the two?
Of course it is. Look, the body of the small ones of 60 centimeters has an elongated skull, very long, where the junction with the neck is in the middle of the skull. The foramen magnum, which is where the neck meets the skull, is halfway. In terrestrial species, the foramen magnum and the junction with the neck is in the posterior part of the skull, on the posterior floor of the skull. So this is the first difference, that the neck is exactly in the middle, balancing the whole size of the skull. The skull in turn is very light, very hard because it is bone, but light because it has many empty spaces called pneumatizations. The space of the eyes is not deep, it is very shallow, and this causes the eyes to have a large orbit and to have been protruding, that is to have been very, very large outwards, and this would allow them a much wider vision capacity. They do not have a nose, although they do have the orifices, and the mouth has no chewing apparatus and no teeth. It is simply two bones, very similar to what would be the beak of a bird. Then in the neck, it has 4 vertebral bodies, but it has very large spaces between vertebrae. These large spaces may have been occupied by cartilage, and this makes a reference or an image very similar to turtlenecks, which are retractable, can elongate and can contract, the necks of turtles. After the neck comes exactly one complete bone that goes from end to end, a single bone that is very similar to the one that all birds have and is called the furcula. In birds, this bone allows the upper limbs to become their wings. But here in these bodies, this furcula allows the articulation of the arms to be of wide movement. The arms have a bone corresponding to the humerus and one bone after the elbow, a single bone. Normally we have 2, the radius and ulna, and most species have these 2 bones, but here we are only looking at one, which immediately without passing through carpal bones goes to a single bone and the 3 fingers. Okay, as for the spine, all the vertebral bodies are very small and the ribs come out, but the ribs are complete from end to end, right? They are not divided as in us that reach the sternum and that we have pairs of ribs. This is a complete rib from end to end, and the space inside allows for very restricted organ space. But in the CT scans, we can see the presence of these organs. We have not yet determined which organs they are or what function they had, but there are organs present.
Did they test or take samples or not of the organs?
No, everything by tomography. Where we did take samples was in the abdomen in order to take samples of these eggs, and we found that these eggs do have organic material or matter. However, the team of Russians from St. Petersburg, they were able to make a 3-dimensional reconstruction of these eggs and were able to find inside these eggs the outline or residue of what would have been a developing embryo. And this is well described by the Russian team of Dr. Konstantin Korotkov. So you can see that figure of what could be an embryo. Then comes the hip, and the hip is something very particular because it is not a pelvis like the one we have or the one we could imagine in similarity with the species we know, since it is only composed of 2 practically vertical bones, which is where the lower limb articulates and has a movement of displacement for standing. Only straight and up to there. This is with respect to small bodies. As for the large body of Mary, obviously it is the most similar and the most similar to a human. However, already taking more particular awareness, we see that the skull is much larger and elongated. This allows a 30 to 35% greater capacity of content within. The skull, the eyes, the orbits are much larger. The nose and mouth are practically similar to us. They have no ear, no auricle, only has the ear hole. The whole skeletal structure is very similar to the human. However, the bones are thicker, more robust, that unlike with the 60 centimeter bodies, the bones of these 60 centimeter bodies are hollow inside, and this makes them strong but light, okay? In some of these, we know that there is an interosseous septum inside the bone, but it is still completely hollow, while in the large body of Maria, the bone is very similar to that of the human, but it is more robust, it is stronger, it is thicker in its dimensions, it has a larger size in its dimensions than that of a normal human. And the rest of the body is practically similar to ours, except in the hand and feet, because precisely the bones of the carpus and the tarsus have less number of bones, and from there the 3 metacarpals or metatarsals, and from there her 3 fingers with 4 phalanges or 5 phalanges, okay? However, in the foot we find that Mary has a position more or less in this form, where the heel, which is a single bone, goes straight with 4 metatarsal bones, and immediately the 3 toes come out, which end in a claw shape. Something very important that we saw in the fingers and toes is that Maria has fingerprints, but these fingerprints are very different from those derived from a primate, which in a primate have waves or circles, and in Maria are completely straight and parallel to each other. This type of footprint is only found in animals such as lizards and geckos.
Okay, like a reptile.
Reptiles, exactly, but they are not related to primate footprints. Okay. And in my opinion, the position of the foot where you see an end like this with arch and toes down, this is derived from the position and length of the foot, which allows it to move and walk with longer steps and for greater traction in its displacement, in its bipedal mechanics. But those are more or less the differences or particulars. Something very important in Maria's body, we specifically looked for mammary traces, mammary remains, and they were not found. And we searched for navel. No navel was found either. Then she is completely smooth on her thorax and abdomen without any mammary remnants and without any navel remnants. And this is something very relevant because in time last year a body called Montserrat was found. And this body called Montserrat has a fetus inside. There is an animal called the platypus. This animal called platypus has a reproduction process called thermoderma, which reproduces without the need of a placenta, but in a kind of soft egg. Very soft egg. The platypus is the first mammal in evolution. It is the first mammal. Okay. The platypus has no navel, and the platypus has no mammary glands being a mammal. Okay, so this interesting platypus is very similar to what we could find in Montserrat and the fetus it has inside Raphael. And this would obviously be coincident returning to the subject with Maria because of the absence of breasts and the absence of navel. Okay, these are broadly speaking in a great summary the differences that we could find in these bodies, both 60 centimeters and large bodies in relation to our anatomy.
Very good, very good. And the fingerprints you found on Maria, did you also find on the 60 centimeter bodies, or were there no fingerprints on the small ones?
In the 60 centimeter bodies, we have so far found no fingerprints, although we have found nail beds and nails or claws. We have found no fingerprints, but in the large bodies, we found fingerprints in Maria, and then we intentionally searched for them in Montserrat, and they were also found there.
And they have nails too, or something that looks like a fingernail, right?
Something similar to a nail bed that would allow a nail to grow. That's right.
Okay, wow. regathering Montserrat that has the fetus. I saw a presentation you made at the Congress, and you can clearly see the little head of the tridactyl and the spine or vertebrae. And also, you also kind of see the 3 fingers there a little bit.
That is correct, yes.
Very impressive.
That fetus inside Montserrat was an incredible find. The first one to see it was the doctor from Peru who was doing the X-rays. He was the first to see it, but did not fully describe it. When these images came to me, I started to make an analysis of all the anatomical structures that should correspond to a fetus. And obviously, what is easier on the eye is the size of the skull. Very large, the spine is clearly seen with its ribs, and images of the arm and leg are superimposed with high magnifications, but with a high degree of resolution. I managed to identify the feet, arms, and managed to identify the hands and feet were tridactyl. And this is something fantastic because obviously, regardless of the fact that it is there, if I can assure you, impossible to fake it or replicate it to that detail, it is important because it allows us to understand that we have then here an evolution and development of a species. Because you have Maria as a mature adult, you have Sebastian and Santiago as a child and adolescent primary stages, and you have Montserrat in a mature adult stage, but in reproduction, and you have a developing fetus. Then you have all the growth, you have fetuses, you have children, you have youth, you have young adults, and you have mature adults. So from a single species, you are already talking about different stages of evolution and development, which is impossible to falsify, which corroborates the authenticity, corroborates that they are organic biological entities and that in their moment had lived. However, we are still here with the question of what is missing. We do not have where they came from, which are their ancestors, and we do not have their descendants either. We do not have the phylogeny. Therefore, you are talking about a species at a moment and at a stage without previous history and without subsequent history, and this makes difficult the biological analysis to be able to embed it in the evolution of the species in Darwin's taxonomic tree, because with these characteristics that I have told you, where they are tridactyl and tridactyly is seen in birds and reptiles, where the skeletal structure is of primates, you are talking about a line, a branch parallel to human evolution, but a branch that does not have an origin, a common trunk, and the fact that it does not have the end point where the species has arrived, either to its extinction or to its natural evolution, makes it completely isolated, and this makes it even more extraordinary and deserving of a thorough investigation by the scientific community.
Sure, yes. I have so many questions about that. Well, to begin with, I wanted to say that when I started to investigate the 60 centimeter bodies, because for me that was the hardest thing to accept, so I did my research with the videos and the interviews that you and Dr. Rios. And when I saw the tomography of Josefina where they show the furcula and the joints, I thought, okay, the furcula, as you said, is a characteristic of birds also. It seems that it has many characteristics that are very similar to the theropods. I think it is called theropods, which are dinosaurs that have those characteristics. They have bones that are hollow. They have 3 fingers. They have the furcula. You can see that it's one single piece.
All this was a research development carried out by biologist José de la Cruz Rios. The biologist José de la Cruz Rios, who is a magnificent biologist who also has knowledge of the evolution of certain species, obviously because of his training, but also because of his knowledge of the evolution of certain species. The work he performs, he was the one who discovered all those details and all those similarities with dinosaurs, with theropods. And the truth is that it is a phenomenal job, because when I get to Me already with this information, and I begin to make an analysis of comparative anatomy or comparative anatomy with other species, because you realize that these bodies have their own anatomical structure that relates them to those of 60 centimeters, relates them more to the evolution of reptiles, to birds coming from dinosaurs. So it's a fantastic thing to do, flying imagination and mind.
Yes, and what I wanted to ask about that is they did DNA studies on Victoria, who is also one of the 60 centimeter bodies. Do you know if they compared that to, for example, birds' DNA? Because I know they compared the DNA of Maria to obviously primates, but did they do any comparison of the DNA of the little ones to birds or?
A genetic study was made of both. Mary as of small bodies and was compared with 1 million species. Equally, and no similarity or familiarity with any of them resulted. However, what you are commenting on is very important because we have pending DNA analysis between each of the bodies, and this is to relate the familiarity between them. That is, what familiarity there is between Josefina, Albert, Victoria, Clara, and Mauricio, and what familiarity there is between Maria, Sebastian, Santiago, Montserrat, and Rafael. That DNA study that is still to be done will be very important, because if we make a correlation and we manage to find that they are family, we are not only talking about a species, but we are already talking about families, and therefore we are already talking about social organisms.
Wow.
There we would be talking about another topic.
What I wanted to ask, let's see, I know that you are currently studying the bodies, or correct me if I'm wrong, the bodies of Clara and Mauricio that are in Mexico, no? Are these bodies the same or almost the same as Josefina's and Victoria's, or do they also have some differences between them?
Look, your question is a very good one. Fortunately, and I feel privileged, I have been the only one or one of the few scientists who has been able to study all the bodies registered as official, besides loose pieces, loose skulls, loose hands, and so on. Indeed, all of them are in Peru, in Ica, in the University of Ica in Peru. However, officially and through official channels, 2 bodies are in Mexico, those of Clara and Mauricio. These bodies that are here in Mexico, I also had the opportunity to study them, and I have done the same studies on these bodies as on the others: X-rays, tomography, 3-dimensional reconstruction, fluoroscopy, DNA sampling, carbon-14, metallurgy for the implants, and also histopathology for the tissues, especially the skin. And the results I have reached are that these bodies, Clara and Mauricio, are exactly identical and corresponding to what we have in Peru, like Josefina, Victoria, Albert, the family, all there. That is to say, yes, they belong to the same group, to the same species, obviously, although in general they are identical, equal bodies. In the particularity, they have different features. It is very similar to what happens in humans. As humans, we are all the same. We all have the same head, ears, hands, feet, heart, lungs, brain. We are identical, but in particularities, we are different. Some are tall, others are short. Some have hair, others are hairless. In short, these particularities are observed equally in these species and in the bodies of these 2 species. In general, they are identical. They are similar in their generalities, but in their particularities, they have traits that make them individualized. And that is something very valuable in the social context research aspect.
Of course, of course. And those, for example, I believe I have heard that there are 7 species that they have found. Among those bodies you mentioned, are those all the species or are there others?
Well, look, officially, I can refer and point out only 2 species. Small bodies of 60 centimeters, large bodies between 1.20 meters to 1.70 meters. Okay, 2. However, there are separate pieces that do not correspond to either. For example, there are 45 centimeter long tridactyl hands. There is a very famous one that has on the back of the hand a metallic circle with reliefs and some lines and carvings there. Those 45 centimeter long hands obviously do not correspond to 60 centimeter bodies, nor do they correspond to the dimensions of large bodies. These hands would correspond to a body of approximately more than 2 in height. However, we have not seen that body, we have only seen the hand. We have separate skulls that would correspond are very similar to a human. They are very similar to a human skull. They have teeth, they have noses, they have eyes, they have no ears. And the skull is long, elongated, with a greater capacity for internal content. That would correspond to one of two things, either to the bodies of Montserrat and Maria, more or less, or they could correspond due to their size, because they are larger skulls. Larger, a skull bigger than Maria's, a skull bigger than Montserrat's, and so on. They are larger, they could correspond to another body with different characteristics. There you are talking about two different ones. However, we have information that has not yet been published, information that has not yet been shared because we have to corroborate it, and above all, we have to be certain of its veracity, that it is true and that it is not false. We have evidence that there are two more distinct bodies. There are some very small bodies that even have sort of wings on the back. Everyone has mentioned them as wings, but to me they are fins or flaps, not wings. These bodies are very strange. They are very strange. We have not taken DNA samples. We have no further reference for these. It would be a third species, different. And then the two I already told you about, plus 3 more, we already have 5. And there may be 2 or 2 missing pieces that would make a total of 7 different species likely. But I cannot confirm that at this moment because I have not had physical access to those bodies or to those pieces so far. I can only limit myself to 2 species, those of 60 centimeter and the bodies corresponding to Maria and Sebastian and Montserrat.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, did you have a chance to study Santiago's body directly?
Yes, I have had the opportunity to analyze, physically be there, touch them, take samples and analyze them. The bodies, I will tell you, of Maria, Sebastian, Santiago, Montserrat and her fetus Rafael, 5 of the big ones. And the smaller ones, I've had the opportunity to be with Josefina, Albert, Victoria. There are 3 bodies that have no name and they are called the family, the Clara and Mauricio. In addition to these, externally, I have had the opportunity to see 2 more bodies of the 60 centimeter basis, and I have been able to observe and analyze about 12 to 13 loose heads. Of the 60 centimeter ones, I have been able to observe and analyze about 3 large heads of the type of Maria and Josephine. 3 large heads, and I have been able to observe and analyze 345 centimeters tridactyl hands. 3 hands. This is everything I have seen, analyzed, taken x-rays, taken samples, taken tomography. I have performed histopathological studies, metallurgy studies, everything on all these bodies that I mentioned to you.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. I have a question from Santiago because in another interview of, I think it was Joyce again, and I think it was with Pavel, he said that he has temporary teeth and adult teeth. Can you tell me or talk to me how it can be determined that they are both stages, not maybe extra teeth. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. Obviously, this is based on forensic dentistry studies. And indeed, in the bodies of Maria, Santiago, Sebastian, and Montserrat, one of the characteristics that we have seen on X-rays and CT scans is that they have the presence of almost complete dentition. Specifically, we are seeing that due to the difference in size, Maria is 1.68 meters, Sebastian is 1.40 meters or so, and Santiago is 1.10 meters or so in terms of size. In terms of bone development, we determine that Santiago and Sebastian are young bodies, either of a child or adolescent. In the particularity of the teeth, making the analysis, the dentures can tell us if we are talking about a child or an adult. In dentures, we can find the alveolar spaces of an adult tooth or of an immature or temporary tooth. In this particular case, it is perfectly observed that the teeth that are exposed in its alveolar development is reduced. This tells us that they are temporary teeth that at some point would have to fall. And behind or below these teeth, you have the teeth with a larger alveolar root that would correspond to a permanent tooth. In what we know in normal dentistry, this permanent tooth by its evolution would push the temporary tooth falls out and the permanent tooth remains. These alveolar and root odontological traces in forensic odontology are of great relevance because they can tell us an approximate age of the individual, because they can tell us more or less the odontological wear and tear, and therefore what they ate, what was their chewing process, and how much wear or chewing effort they made. But above all, and what I would like to study and has not been done, they have the root. And by having the root, we can obtain intact DNA that would allow us to do more DNA studies with better quality, and the results that this would yield would be phenomenal.
And why aren't they doing these studies? That study, for example, that study, which would be, as you said, something very good.
Well, we currently have a problem. All these studies, in addition to being complex and sophisticated, are expensive. And being very expensive, we need a source of financing. And this source of financing can only occur in two ways. Either through public institutions that lend their equipment and resources, or through private institutions that finance these studies. At the present time, with the controversy about this, very few institutes or institutions want to get involved in this, and the private support is waiting for the scientific positioning. And since the scientific positioning is still far away, well, the private funding is not flowing. Therefore, at this moment, there are a number of studies that we could do and that we can obtain great results from them, but we do not have a place to carry them out or how to pay for them. That is why we are inviting and insisting that these scientists and institutions join the research that is necessary.
Of course, hopefully the conference, or when Tim Burchett met Jaime, hopefully that will attract more US scientists that are going to study this. Because for me, that detail of the teeth, that detail was the one that told me that this cannot be falsified.
That is correct.
And for what purpose? What for? If somebody wants to do this or wants to set up something like that, oh yeah, I'm going to include the baby teeth in too. Nobody's going to think about that.
It is completely out of context. But also, if there was some brilliant, I'm not going to say perverse, brilliant mind that could have the ability to do that and replicate what by nature takes place, well, whoever did it is a genius.
That's true.
It is impossible to falsify it. It is impossible.
Of course. Wow. Yes, it's that detail that changed my mind.
Very valuable.
Okay, in one of the interviews you gave, you said that you rehydrated a sample. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course, from one of the samples that we brought from Peru and from a loose hand that we obtained, we put them in a rehydration process. And this is a technique that is well known and developed especially by the FBI. They were the pioneers in the rehydration of bodies. We apply the same criteria and knowledge in the rehydration process based on the principle that the diatomaceous earth powder dehydrated these bodies. Once we rehydrate it, the purpose was not to see what they would look like naturally because they were very small pieces. The purpose was to be able to obtain rehydrated tissue that we could put in paraffin so that it could be viewed and analyzed under the microscope and histopathological studies could be performed. And here is where we find that these samples that belong to 60 centimeter bodies have a very curious histopathology because the skin is practically keratin, which is normal, but this skin is very similar to what we could find in the skin of toads or frogs, where there are certain vesicles, and these vesicles in the skin would allow the secretion or segregation of the liquid. You see, some frogs, some toads have like a certain liquid, a certain slime on their skin. It is very similar to what was found here. And these results are very, very relevant because then they would make us think that the 60 centimeter bodies had this skin similar to frogs, toads with these vesicles, and perhaps because some species were also found to have traces of feathers. In birds, the process of attachment of the feathers to the skin has very particular structures that were also observed there, but they were observed at the level, I insist, at a microscopic level. So we are talking about possibly micro feathers in the skin. This I cannot assure you because I have no evidence. However, we have the comparative reference of the surface of the skin of both birds and reptiles, frogs or toads, which are similar to the histological structures that we find or that we manage to find after rehydration of these tissues.
How interesting that is. Wow. It should be good. Hopefully that lawsuit will go well, at least. I don't know how long that will take. Let's see. I think they have done an autopsy or are going to do an autopsy on some of the bodies. I imagine it would be difficult, obviously.
Okay, look, of the large bodies, we have not performed any necropsy, no autopsy, no. We have completed the virtual autopsies, the virtual necropsies of the three-dimensional reconstruction of the CT scan, okay? But up to there, it is merely virtual. Physically, we have not opened any body, and this is merely with the intention of protecting, preserving, and conserving the bodies until we can take them to an institution of great relevance that will allow us now to perform this type of studies. And this has to be in big institutions, big universities like Harvard, Oxford, Yale, things like that, okay? We can't do it in a private laboratory with scarce resources because you lose a unique opportunity because necropsy is a one-time event. After performing that necropsy, everything is already altered tissue, okay?
Right, it would be lost.
Now, with the small bodies, we have not performed any open body necropsy for conservation and preservation. However, there is unfortunate evidence that in Peru, and I am not going to go into much detail on this so as not to offend or attack anyone, but in Peru, a certain doctor in Peru broke some bodies. Rather, he broke a body, and when he broke it, he removed pieces of bone. He opened the abdomen and took out an egg. He took out an egg, and he did all this with a hammer, orthopedic chisel, and it ended up being, how shall I say, a butchery, everything he did, because he did it without the care and he did it without the delicacy of taking samples with an objective. He did it with the eagerness to break the body to take this out, and at the end of the day, nobody knows where these samples and pieces. So at the end of the day, there was nothing, and the body of this mummy was practically destroyed.
What a pity. I didn't know about that.
Nobody knew about it. Nobody knows about it because it remained in Peru. Joyce Mantilla is the one who has this information and has not made it known. Joyce Mantilla, because it is something very, very regrettable. because they must be conserved and preserved until they reach a level that allows them to be adequately studied.
Exactly.
Preserving the sample, the body, not destroying it, no. So nobody knows this.
Well, thank you for giving me this information. It is very, very unfortunate, really. And so I understand the reason for not doing an autopsy. And I think when more bodies are found and when they have more scientists, as you said, from Harvard who are interested and want to approach at that time with those resources, then yes. But the way he did it, well, too bad. Let's see, can you tell us a little bit about the latest of Maria's DNA? Because I did see Pavel's interview. I don't know if you had a chance to see Pavel's interview with Dr. Drangel, and it was very technical. Obviously, there were things that I had to investigate. For example, I didn't know he was talking about reeds, and I didn't know what he was talking about. So I had to do some research on that. But can you tell us more or less something very briefly about what he found?
Well, Dr. Ricardo Rangel is a person. He's an eminent person in terms of DNA interpretation and molecular biology. He has been conducting studies of the results and the already published analysis of Maria's DNA. And he was the one who found the detail that in the 70% that does have a correlation to the DNA of known biological matter, he was the one who found the correlation with the bonobo monkey, the chimpanzee, and the human ancestor from South Asia, from the Philippines, okay? He was the one who found it. He, along with another doctor from Canada, a doctor from Canada, have also found that there are codons. Codons are nucleotide sequences that repeat. These repeating codon sequences are repeated sequentially in very specific spaces. And this only happens when a kind of genetic engineering is done. This genetic engineering, for example, can be seen in transgenic corn. Okay.
Then it only happens in that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it only happens in that.
Exactly, because this constant repetition that is done in the genetic engineering of transgenic corn is known as signature. Signature. Okay, they have been finding pieces of pod DNA where there are repeated codons, being very similar and very similar to what is the signature of genetic engineering. This is an amazing thing that if we can corroborate it and prove it, you're talking about these species not only had evolution, but they had genetic engineering in their design. Yes, water with this.
Wow.
So what Dr. Rangel has explained, the truth is that it is very complex, it is very technical, but the relevance of the findings made by Dr. Rangel, together with a doctor from Canada and the clear doctor who is in Switzerland, and other people who have dedicated themselves to analyze Maria's DNA, show us that the complexity of the DNA, and we are only talking about the 70% that we have been able to analyze, study, and replicate, because it is a very, very complex DNA. And that still leaves the 30% that we have not been able to identify. And that 30% is a lot.
Yes, as you said yourself, between us and chimps is 2%?
2%.
Very big difference, very large, very large.
So it's not how much we are alike, but how many of us are different and why we are different. And why we would be different? There are only two explanations, either because we had a completely different evolution in different places and conditions, different circumstances, or because we are facing a parallel evolution of different species in which one did not survive and the other is us.
Okay. I wanted to ask also on the size and morphology of the cranial box, there is something that we can infer. Can we infer that they were intelligent? Can we tell if they were like us, more or less?
As far as intelligence is concerned, I could not determine whether they are more or less intelligent, because intelligence is measured as the ability to adapt to adverse circumstances, and I could not determine that in this body of this species, for example in Maria. However, Maria's skull, in its space, as it is more elongated in its intracranial space, is 30% larger than that of a human. That 30% higher than that of a human, what does it tell us about? The content of neuronal or neurological or cerebral material is 30% larger than that of a human. Now, whether or not it's smarter, I don't know, but that it had a higher storage capacity, definitely yes, 30% more. Now, for other contexts such as the metal plates that we have found, Montserrat has a plaque here in the center, like a sun of a golden metal that apparently is gold. I do not remember if it is Sebastian or Santiago. It has a plaque on the back of the neck, on the back. And that plaque has a series of undulations or continuous U-type graphics. The management of other implants, such as those on the back of the hands or those found in different parts of the body. And these metal alloys that have a biofunctional fusion with the skin, which does not cause rejection, which does not cause allergy, but which does cause them to adhere and fuse between the metal and the skin. To me in particular, it tells me that they had an advance, a technological advance. And by having this technological advance that allowed them to make this type of alloys and this type of implants, they obviously require a process of advanced or superior intelligence. But this is my personal opinion. The intelligence context I cannot determine. I believe that if they were intelligent, I can't determine it, I just believe it. What I can and should limit myself to is that in terms of capacity, there is a 30% higher organic content capacity in the skulls of Maria, Sebastian, Montserrat, and Santiago.
Very good. Okay. What I am thinking is, how do the beings have the 3 fingers? Who was it that put these implants? Because I don't know, how did they have, what was the movement they had? Was it like that or just like that? Who was it that put the implants in them? Do I make myself clear?
Yes. Who was it? I really don't know. How did they do it? I don't know either. But the movement of the hands, tridactyl, is an enveloping movement. They do not need the opposition of the fingers. Their long fingers allow them to wrap around whatever they have to grasp or hold. An example of what I'm talking about is what you do with chopsticks. Nothing but this is rigid. Chopsticks allow you to hold while being rigid, but if you could move these chopsticks in flexion and wrap, they do allow you a holding and manipulation capability with your hands.
Okay. Well, if they are, if it was themselves or humans, it would still be a very interesting thing because it was a long time ago. Then either would be very interesting. Okay, last question.
With pleasure.
Again, I saw many interviews of yours, and I saw one where you said that you don't think the bodies will be accepted in the scientific community in your lifetime. Why do you think so?
Look, any process that requires a concept change or paradigm shift takes time. The main factor against these bodies is precisely time. They are degrading, they are deteriorating because they are not in the right conditions for their preservation. If we do not preserve them, they will disappear and time will make them disappear into oblivion. If this happens, as I am telling you, I believe I will never see in my lifetime, I will never see this work, this research recognized. Alone, there is only one opportunity for this to happen, and that is for the scientific community to become formally involved in research. But here I have a problem. There are two types of scientists. There are scientists who are open-minded to new discoveries, and they are few. And there are scientists who are strict, methodical, methodological, and who seem like the Holy Inquisition. And if it is not what has already been said, and if it is not what has already been demonstrated, then it does not exist. And this group of rigid scientists have blindness. They have a blindness against research, and they are the ones who stay. They stay behind a desk, they stay inside their labs, and they stay behind their computers, and they don't come out. This does not mean that they are bad. They are very good at what they do, but they refuse to accept new concepts, new findings, and new paradigms. And if you don't go along with them, then you're bad and you're labeled and attacked and you're demeaned, okay? And these are the majority. Between these two groups, there is a big communication problem, and the big communication problem is called social networks, the internet. Then, and in the communication process between these two types of scientists, you bring the internet, you bring social networks, and this internet and these social networks only bring opinions of people who did not study what is being analyzed. For most of these opinions bring a negative bias and bring a negative prejudice because it is very difficult to accept novelty. And what do I mean by difficult to accept novelty? For you to build something, it takes a long time and a lot of effort. But for you to destroy something, you only have to tell a lie or gossip and it is immediately destroyed. For you to generate new knowledge, it takes years. And I'll give you an example, recent. The first thing they said about the COVID vaccine was that it had been developed so fast that it was no good. That was the first thing they said. However, everyone went and got vaccinated. Okay, what are seeing now, 3 years after the pandemic? that indeed the vaccine that was developed at an impressive speed with the maximum of technological capabilities. But what was missing was to see the results and the side effects it would cause in a human being. Well, I transfer this example of the vaccine to the example of the bodies and the mummies. At this time, the research has been in line with the resources and capabilities we have had, and we need to expand them. The only way we need to expand them is time and for other scientists to get involved with us. But as long as wills are not united, progress will not be made. And that is where I say I hope and wish with all my heart that there is impact like Tim Burchett, that there is impact like John McDowell, that there is impact like Joyce Mantilla, that there is impact like Jaime Maussan, that there is impact like Stephanie Carrillo, who want to know and who want to know the truth. From its source, and who approach the source to investigate it and generate their own opinion based on facts, studies, and analysis. Understand? But you are very few. Just like me, we are very few. The vast majority, you have a lot of people who only add to the novelty, but who do not research and do not study and who just give their opinions and not, well, I think this is not, but I think this is limited to your personal opinion, not to an analysis based on a lot of research. So what do we need to move this forward? People like you, people like those I mentioned, but they are very few. Hopefully someday there will be the echo and the awareness to accept this. But there is a big problem. If what I have been telling you and what you have been researching is true, can you imagine what will happen in the consciences of the people? You are going to have to change concepts of history. You are going to have to change concepts of biology. You are going to have to change concepts of religion, and we are going to get into trouble.
Yes, it is very well said what you said. For me, as you said, and as is true in many cases, in many issues in life, is to have an open mind. That is the most important thing, to have an open mind, to be able to investigate and see all the possibilities of what it could be. Because if you have your mind like this possibility, it can be this one. But if you are like that, you don't see it. So I want to thank you, Dr. Zalce, for having your open mind and for telling people about your research, the results and everything you did, all the studies. I want to thank you for being with us today.
I would like to thank you, one, for the consideration of taking me into account. Two, the courage to have invited me, because we had not seen each other, nor talked, nor met, nor anything else. So talking to a stranger is always difficult. Three, your interest in getting involved in such a difficult and controversial topic. But I thank you very much for your quality and human warmth, because you have treated me with great respect, and I appreciate it very much. And for me, it is a pleasure and honor to be with you and share my knowledge with you, and I hope your audience will find it useful.
Of course it is. I hope this is not the last time and we get to see you again. And with more data, hopefully some news, I don't know, maybe more scientists in your life will come closer and accept it in your lifetime. Hopefully.
Delighted to continue sharing with you everything that comes advancing and evolving with this. And I thank you for your good wishes and count on me for whatever you require. I am at your complete disposal and at your service.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zalce.